All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Edouard Clément. I'm the executive director at the Energy Modeling Hub. So Maddie, if you want to maybe just present the next slide. So welcome to this second webinar on the Open Insight series. So for those of you that don't know us, so EMH is a consortium of Canadian university and partners. We work to make energy modeling more open, transparent, and useful for decision making across Canada. So as I was mentioning, this is our second webinar in our Open Insight series, and today we'll be exploring how linking models can help us better understand the complex interaction between policy, technology, and electricity systems. We'll look at powerful linkage tools and application between three models, CIMS, silver, and copper, and how they work together to provide a more complex view of Canada energies and economic futures. So as a quick reminder, so this webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our website in a few days. You are allowed to ask questions using the Q&A box or the chat box as well, but the Q&A is really the best way to move forward, and we'll take time at the end of the webinar to answer some of the questions. And hopefully you'll find this interesting. So there's a lot of materials and ground to cover today. So without further ado, we'll start right away with Devon Azevedo, who's the project director of Open Insights, to set the stage for today's session and present the agenda. So Devon, up to you.
Thanks so much, Edouard, and thanks everybody for joining. As Edouard was mentioning, I'm Devon, and for those who haven't been able to meet before, lead of the project, of the Open Insights project, and for those I haven't given the Open Insights spiel to before, I'll do a quick few sentence version now. The project is all about trying to build a modeling suite or modeling platform that is fully open source, and kind of crucially, and we'll talk more about this in a few slides, but is really focused on where there's benefit developing linkages or integrations between models where that allows us to unlock new policy questions. So the purpose of this webinar is to showcase the first linkage or integration that we've done as part of this project in collaboration with Brad's team at SFU Emerge and in collaboration with the EMH. And we're really excited to share that more with you. But before we do start to share more specifically about that linkage, I just want to pass over to Brad, who will share a bit more about some updates on CIMS since the last webinar about a month ago that was focused on CIMS, as well as to give a bit of a motivation for this linkage in general. So over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Devon. So I'm just going to give a very short overview of the CIMS model, just for any of you who weren't at the last webinar. So CIMS is an energy economy model, which we use primarily to assess the effect of policies on the energy system, but we get down into quite a lot of the details around energy end uses through all different kinds of sectors. You can see an outline there. But down even to the technologies, and we really get into the details of different technologies, both existing and ones that are slowly coming into the market or ones that are prospective and haven't even reached the market yet. One of the main strengths of the CIMS model is that it's behaviorally realistic. So we try to bring in elements of how people actually make choices in their day-to-day lives, either firms or households. And so that really means that CIMS is trying to look at what would people do for different choices rather than what they should do. And that differentiates it from an optimization model where that's trying to find maybe the lowest cost for how to do something. So CIMS is going to be looking at what are the effects given these policy choices or given these technology assumptions. It's a partial equilibrium model, so we're not doing a lot of the macroeconomic feedbacks. We have some of that in CIMS, but it's a simplified version of how those effects might work. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that's one way that we might connect CIMS to another model. As we mentioned before, CIMS covers the entire energy system, and then we try to bring in a few other associated sectors, but we're really looking at energy production, any transformation or transmission, and then how we're using that energy and then emissions that are associated with it. We have a long historical period, and then we look out, many decades, and CIMS is really trying to look at the long-term changes in a system. The last thing I'll say here is that we're releasing the model open source. So this is in collaboration with the Energy Modeling Forum, and it's also being currently funded in large part by NRCan through their Energy Innovation Program. We'll be releasing the open source code, and there'll be a link at the end of the presentation. So currently the open source code and the base model is now available. This is a beta version of the model, so it's still being updated and we're still making changes to it. But you're available to go and download it and try to use it. Maybe we'll go to the next slide. So just as some ideas about why we might want to link a model like CIMS to other models. So CIMS in itself covers most of the energy system and can make provide many interesting results on its own. But there are certain things that we don't cover in a lot of details that we might want to connect to another model. So in there I've shown in green questions or topics that we might want to explore that CIMS doesn't cover all the details. So we're going to talk today about linking to an electricity system model. And that's where we might want to get into more details around, peak load or limits to different types of technologies, wind and solar, geographical limitations, things like that. We don't cover any of that in CIMS. And so we might want to link to a more detailed model to bring in that information. And we can go back and forth between them. The other type of model we often might think about linking to is a macroeconomic model to bring in those details around household income distributions or how people make choices around substituting different products, things like that. So that's not the topic for today's linking discussion, but there are other models in the Open Insights suite that, down the road, we're hoping to link CIMS to as well. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Brad. And then, if we go to the next slide, or this slide. This is similar to what Brad was just saying, so I won't dwell on it too much, but I just want to come back to the motivation for the overall building of linkages between models kind of more generally within the Open Insights project. And so as Brad was just highlighting earlier, really, we're trying to build these linkages to unlock new questions. We've thrown up a few of the example questions that in Open Insights we're particularly interested in. The one that's kind of highlighted at the top is the one that we kind of anticipate being able to dive into more detail through the CIMS copper-silver linkage, which is one we'll be showcasing today. But as Brad just mentioned, the kind of next step is to start to be able to dive more into or unlock questions that are more related to broader economic impacts, global transition, trade, and how that impacts Canada's transition. And that would be unlocked through a linkage to a macro model, which will come next. So I just wanted to ask, similar to Brad, give a sneak peek to that coming over the next year. And then if we go to the next slide, again, just quickly, I forgot that with the interactive part, I don't have the control over the button. So maybe, Maddie, if you click through it, thank you. So as you may have seen in previous presentations, we're trying to, through Open Insights and together with EMH and partners like Brad and SFU and others, trying to build a modeling platform that really covers all sectors in varying levels of granularity, as well as with varying spatial and temporal resolutions. And so that's kind of the ultimate vision of the MC platform. And this CIMS copper silver linkage is kind of our first release related to kind of linking those together in a way that can then kind of allow users to leverage the different kind of strengths of those models across different spatial temporal resolutions and sectoral granularities. And then if we go to the next slide, the final slide for me, in case it, I guess, hasn't already been kind of clear, in Open Insights, what we're really focused on is not just developing those individual models, but then particularly focused on releasing those linkages. And so, as both Brad and myself now have mentioned a few times, the ultimate ambition is to create a platform that has linked models that cover quite a few different models that allow you to explore macroeconomic and economic indicators, labor indicators, system reliability, and everything. And so that's the ultimate vision that we're building towards. And what's in blue here is what we kind of have already developed. And then particularly 3 of those 4 in blue is what we're going to focus on today, which is CIMS Copper Silver. And with that, hopefully in that helpful broader context, I'm going to pass over to Maddie to dive into and start actually showcasing what we've developed and what by the end of this call will be fully kind of released and open source in its beta version.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. As mentioned, I'll be getting more into the methodology of it. So for all you modelers out there, this is the really interesting part, in my opinion. So as we saw from that previous flow chart, showing how all the models can link together, they also kind of had purposes in that linkage, which we have kind of categorized different models into in order to fill a niche to really explore a research question. So for example, CIMS, we've categorized as being really good at representing energy demand growth. Copper is a capacity expansion model, really good at representing capacity expansion, specifically in the power sector. And then silver is our power system dispatch model, and it is able to get a much more in-depth look at how the power system operates. So to tie it back to the questions that Devin was trying to answer, this linkage is very well suited to answer questions that contain all of these things as key points that are wanting to be explored within the models and within the modeled results. As we can see here below the nice little boxes that neatly contain all our models, all these models have different temporal and spatial resolutions. So CIMS operates at an annual temporal resolution and a provincial spatial resolution. Copper similarly operates at a provincial spatial resolution, but it uses representative days within the model that are broken down to hourly time steps. So the temporal resolution is actually, the inputs need to be hourly for copper. And then silver is the most resolute. It has hourly temporal resolution, and the spatial resolution is actually at the generation unit level. So it represents each individual generator within a system. So lots of linking of these models is just resolving these different resolutions. It's a lot of R words there. So we can see here when we're passing information from CIMS to copper, we actually need to disaggregate the temporal resolution. So the outputs from CIMS come out just for 1 year, and we need to figure out a way to disaggregate them to an hourly level for copper. And then when we're passing from copper to silver, we need to figure out how to disaggregate spatially. And lots of these linkages are built around these assumptions we make and these specific kind of resolutions of different temporal spatial resolutions. I'll stop saying resolutions now. To be more specific, the information that we're passing from CIMS to copper is projected electricity demand. And Aaron will go into that a little bit more on the next slide. But so CIMS will output an annual electricity demand, and then we are disaggregating that into an hourly level for copper inputs. You can see here that the CIMS copper linkage is actually iterative. So after CIMS run, copper will run, and then actually what will happen is copper will calculate the projected electricity prices based on the projected capacity expansion, and then make sure those prices are compatible with the initial CIMS inputs. And if they're not, CIMS will be rerun, and those two models will run iteratively until convergence is met, just to make sure that the results are in line with each other and not actually displaying completely different or solutions to completely different questions in a way. Once convergence is met, then we can use silver to do a check of the power system and make sure that it's running properly and able to meet demand at every hour of the year, which requires this spatial disaggregation of generation units. So in copper, all generators are grouped together within a province. So for example, Alberta, all natural gas generators are treated as one giant natural gas generator, which is then disaggregated back into its specific individual natural gas generators and passed into silver so that individual generation unit constraints can be respected. Aaron can talk a little bit more about, so the copper silver linkage is a bit more established. It's been released for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years now, but the CIMS copper linkage is much more novel. So Aaron can talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Maddie. Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Hoyle. I'm a researcher with EMH. Just to add a bit more information around this link from CIMS to copper. So Maddie kind of already laid out like the spatial and temporal disaggregation that we're having to do. If we start at the top of the figure on the right-hand side, and this figure is just trying to describe visually like the process that Maddie just laid out and this loop that we have going. So from CIMS to copper, I'll focus on the little green box, the temporal disaggregation of annual electricity demand. The way we're doing that is that we're combining a proportional scaling of observed load, so the actual bulk load that we're seeing on the system in some base year. But with that, we're adding a bottom-up representation of end-use load profiles. So CIMS will give us an idea about how different technology stocks across different energy end uses evolve over time into the future. And then we can map that kind of chunk of electricity demand to specific what we call load shapes. And then we're just stacking those all on top of each other. This is a method that's already kind of been used in similar studies in the academic literature. And most of the data in residential and the commercial sector are coming from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And then in industry, we're using the Electric Power Research Institute's data mostly. And on top of that, most of our transportation data for these load shapes comes from academic research that would be specific to certain regions. On the other side, so from the link from copper to CIMS, we're thinking about how do we get an electricity price back into CIMS based on system costs that are calculated in copper. And so similarly, we're adding to those system cost estimates from copper what we're calling cost components. So those are things like intra-provincial transmission and distribution, administrative costs, so that would include labor or salaries, for example, depreciation, finance charges, and taxes. And basically, that's giving us an annual revenue target. And we're assuming that all of that revenue is recovered via electricity sales, basically. And so it gives us kind of this rough price proxy that we're able to pass back into CIMS. And the convergence criteria that Maddie was discussing, the last thing I'll point out, is in this orange box. And so this iteration runs maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times until both models kind of settle out and we've reached convergence, depending on how we've defined that. Maddie, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so getting kind of into the nitty-gritty more so of how we've implemented the linkage of these models. We tried to develop a structure that obviously was able to accommodate the CIMS copper-silver linkage as it exists, but also, as seen in those previous slides that Devin was showing, would also be expandable and able to accommodate many more linkages as they come up. So the way we've gone about this is to utilize what we're calling a common interim format of the data that's being passed around, which every model within our system is able to pre-process into its own model-specific input format. The reason we do this is because, as seen in one of the previous slides, there are a lot of different collaborators working on these models, and they're not all owned by the same project owner. So there are lots, and as well as just being completely different types of models. So agreeing on a common input format for all these models is in a lot of ways more trouble than it's worth. But if we have this interim common format, all these models are able to communicate without actually interfering with the way these models are run on their own. So the way that this would work, if we follow this flow chart starting at the top left here, the EMH coders database has a whole bunch of currently power system data, expanding hopefully soon into energy system data, that we've written a Python packet or create a Python package for that can process it into our specific data format for our, what we're calling a local database. So you're able to pull from the coder's database, store it in this interim format, and all the specific models. So CIMS will be able to read in from that database, pre-process those inputs into the correct input format, run the model, and then afterwards do any kind of post-processing needed for the linkage. So in this case, CIMS would be doing the temporal disaggregation of electricity demand, and then appending that data back to the local database. Now, when the linkage comes into play is now Copper will read in from that local database, which will include both the coder's data initially pulled, as well as the outputs from CIMS. And it will determine what's more relevant. So it will first read in the coder's data, and then it will override any data it needs to with the CIMS data in order to process that linkage. It will pre-process that into the Copper-specific input format, run Copper, and then do its post-processing steps, which in this case is calculating the electricity price for a potential to send back to CIMS, as well as spatially disaggregating for a potential that silver will be the next step. All this output data will then be appended back to the local database. And then there will be a convergence check on if that CIMS and Copper have converged in electricity price, and it will either send it back to CIMS, and CIMS will do this all over again, or it will have passed convergence and silver will pre-process it into the correct input format. Same thing, run the model, append the outputs back to the local database. And then that database format is also compatible with our visualization platform IDEA. So that whole database can be uploaded into IDEA, as well as individual model outputs from these specific models are able to be inputted into IDEA individually, meaning we'll have an overview of the linked results, as well as an overview of individual model results, and we won't lose any detail or ability to kind of look into the specific model outputs. I know it has been hammered home the value of this linkage a few times already now. I'm going to do it one more time just so it really sticks. So the kind of very more granular reason of this specific linkage, the CIMS Copper Silver linkage, and why it's important from the CIMS to Copper perspective, the iterative linkage between CIMS and Copper can actually explore much more realistic implications of electrification at a high sectoral resolution that CIMS has, as well as Copper benefits by being able to have more certainty about the electricity demand inputs, as opposed to just assuming how electricity will grow. There's a bit more basis for those assumptions and for those modeled outputs from CIMS, as well as being able to better explore how peak demand will change based on specific technology adoption that can be represented in CIMS. On the Copper Silver side, the benefit, as I think I might have briefly mentioned before, is kind of a feasibility test. So Copper is a capacity expansion model that runs with representative days. So it takes certain days of the year and makes sure that those days will run and meet kind of larger scale electricity system power constraints. But silver runs for every hour of the year. So 8,760 hours. And it will check that the proposed electricity system found by Copper will actually be feasible in every hour of the year. As I mentioned before about the kind of structure of this model, this is just a screenshot of most of the configuration file for a linked run. This is different actually than the configuration files used for each specific model, but it actually allows the user from this linked from this configuration file to control model specific parameters within each model. As well, it is easily customizable in terms of being able to add on new models as we develop those linkages, and will in the future be extended to be able to specify which exact linkage you want to run based on just the configuration file. As well, all of this is fully documented in our Read the Docs, which I believe is linked to our GitLab repo. And if not, the link is right here and will be shared after the presentation. Okay. So now I'm going to go into some illustrative scenarios. Basically, we wanted to show some of the benefit of our work and what we've done so far and show how it is working. So to do this, we have added in ITCs into CIMS to really kind of drive home the point. So as implemented, there are specific subsidies attributed to different technologies within CIMS. For the purpose of this scenario, we have kind of bumped up the subsidies, which we're calling our illustrative scenario, just to really show how the models react to these changes in inputs. So these are screenshots of our IDEA platform, just to avoid further technical difficulties. We've just put them into slides, but these are all available on IDEA, or these visualizations are available on IDEA and are interactive. But this is an output from CIMS. And what we're seeing here is net emissions, so the total emissions economy-wide in Ontario for this REF3 scenario is a scenario without ITCs, and this REF ITC high is our scenario with our high ITC level. And we can actually see that by 2050, we're actually seeing slightly less emissions in the ITC scenario than in the reference scenario. And when we look specifically at the industrial minerals sector, which is where one of those ITCs was specifically applied, we can see that that change is even more apparent, that reduction in emissions. Now, the benefit, or one of the great things about CIMS, is we can actually dig even further into the industrial minerals sector and look at exactly why the emissions were going down. Unfortunately, this text might not be the easiest thing to read, but what we can see here is this is the total stock, so total stock of technology within the industrial minerals sector within CIMS that are all competing for the same purpose. So all of these technologies would be providing heat in the industrial minerals sector. And what we can see when ITCs are introduced, there is less coal that is being used, and instead there's a lot more coal with CCS because that technology was subsidized through the ITCs. It also displaced this SING6 technology, which I cannot actually off the top of my head tell you what that means. Maybe Brad or Aaron would be able to tell you more exactly what that technology is referring to. But we can see the impact of these very high ITCs and how it displaces other, or how it makes coal with CCS a much more competitive technology, specifically within the industrial mineral sector within Ontario. Again, this is just the new stock. Before we were looking at total stock adaptation, and we can see the new stock is mainly being added in 2025 and 2030 when the ITCs are applied. And there is less change in 2035 onwards when the ITCs are no longer applied. Similarly, we can actually look into the copper results and the impact of the ITCs within the supply side. So if we look here, we can see that there's slightly more VREs being built out, slightly less gas being built out across Canada when ITCs are on. So we can highlight here. So wind and solar specifically, there is more wind being built, roughly the same amount of solar. But when we actually break this down by region, so if we look at this 2050 system and we break it down by region, we can see that even though the net capacity in Canada doesn't change super drastically, the spatial distribution of where this new capacity is being built out changes drastically. So in Alberta, which we know has very high wind capacity or wind potential, does with ITCs choose to build out a lot more wind. We can also see slightly more wind being built out in Quebec. But what's also really interesting is the neighboring provinces. So Saskatchewan actually has much less total capacity. And Ontario also has less natural gas capacity with these ITCs. And I can show you, for example, for Saskatchewan, why that is. So we can see this dark green is actually imports from Alberta. So in this scenario, this was just, this is obviously a very drastic scenario. This was run with just one representative day, but we can see that Saskatchewan actually decided that the cheaper option, instead of building its own capacity, would be to import from Alberta, where there's better wind potential, and actually chose to meet much less supply from its own local wind and natural gas and instead import. So this is we're able to deep dive in these linked runs into both the implications from the CIMS side and the copper side. Getting a little bit into maybe the weeds, maybe the non-modelers won't be as interested in this, but is very interesting in terms of like the iterative linkage. We can see that this reference scenario, or I can tell you, but this reference scenario converged within 3 iterations. So this reference one, this blue line, is the electricity rate in Alberta for the residential sector for the initial run of CIMS. So this was the initial electricity price input that was input. Then after it ran through CIMS, it passed the results to copper, and then copper calculated the electricity rates. The price actually was dropped quite drastically to this orange line, which, as we can see here, between reference 1 and 2, ended up starting from 2025 onwards mostly, increased the energy demand or the electricity demand in Alberta. And then, sorry to hop around a bit, this green line is then the 3rd iteration where, because of that increased demand, the electricity prices actually went up a little bit. And we actually saw that the electricity demand did decrease between reference 2 and reference 3. So this is just kind of showing the feedback and how CIMS is reactive to that different electricity price feedback. Again, as I was showing you electricity rates, this is just showing specifically the electricity demand in the residential sector. And we can see that that's in line. As electricity prices went cheaper, there was more electricity demand. And then as they got a little bit more expensive, the electricity demand dropped slightly. We can also see the impact on the supply side in Alberta. So, and kind of what drove that change in electricity price. So we can see that as electricity demand increased in CIMS, Alberta built more capacity. Lots of the capacity it ended up building was wind. And then we can see as we got to 2050, lots of that capacity ended up having to be natural gas, but the wind offset the electricity prices, allowing for smaller operational costs, which decreased the electricity rate. Again, as electricity demand dropped a little bit, it didn't build quite as much wind, and the electricity price ended up evening off after this point. I think that's my high-level overview of the illustrative results. So Devin, I believe this is you for next steps.
Yeah, before we move to the Q&A section, we just wanted to highlight kind of what we're hoping people are interested in kind of doing with what we're releasing today. So firstly, as Edward's already been dropping into the chat, the same linkages, so used to saying linkages, same URLs, I should say, as what Edward's been dropping in the chat are here. And so that's for the linked, or the linkage that Maddie has just been presenting is that first link. We'd really love it for the modelers in the virtual room. If you're interested in trying it out, we'd love to have you do that and then send us any feedback. In that last bullet, you can send feedback either that email or, many of you were connected to you kind of through other channels. So just feel free to send feedback however is most convenient. And then to help with that, we have, as Maddie also mentioned, the documentation is live. So both welcome feedback on how useful or not useful the documentation was, and how it relates to what you see in the code of the linkage. And then again, I guess for modelers, as Maddie mentioned, we've tried to make this linkage as customizable as possible. So if you have your own power system model, for example, and you're interested in kind of replacing copper in this linkage with your own power system model, we've tried to make that as easy as possible. And so we'd be really happy to, if you want to get in touch to explore how to do that, or get some support on how to do that, please just let us know, and we'd be really happy to explore that with you. And then also, as Edward already flagged and Brad flagged on one of the earlier slides, the CIMS repo is now live, so the link, relevant link, is there as well. And Brad, feel free to add anything if you want to kind of steer people towards any particular type of feedback or a particular way of giving feedback. But I'm sure that'll be welcome as well.
Yeah, I'll just say, so that link went live yesterday. So be gentle with us because it is definitely still a work in progress. And there's documentation for how to get started, but there's no actual documentation on the model itself yet. That is coming soon.
Wonderful. And yeah, we wouldn't mind if you're also gentle with the linkage feedback as well, but very, very interested in it for sure. And in particular, or maybe one thing, just want to highlight those illustrative scenarios. The policy files to run them will also be, I think, are already live, but if not, will shortly be live in the repos as well. So as Maddie mentioned, the illustrative scenarios that we were just showing are kind of like extreme scenarios that were really just we kind of chose more extreme results just to show kind of bigger impacts, to show you that there is kind of a clear feedback happening in the model. But if you want to then play around with that with, I guess, values that are more interesting to you and perhaps more policy relevant, that's exactly why we've provided those files to allow kind of like an easy startup for somebody to start playing around with something policy relevant. So just wanted to highlight that that's also available. Cool. Should we move to the Q&A, Edward?
Yes, totally. And I think most of it are targeted to you and Aaron as well, and Maddie. So maybe are you able to see them? I think you should go one by one, Devin, and maybe reroute the questions to the right person. So the first one starting with the VRE resource option.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this one is probably Maddie. I think you're best place to answer. I'll just read it out for, I think everybody can see it, but I'll just read it out. Yeah, how are you getting the future VRE resource options? And then bullet any data source for future plans, methods, also resolution for these resources, question mark, clusters or specific project points. Maddie?
Yeah. VRE, so obviously wind and solar, we have copper is pretty spatially disaggregate in this regard, more so than a lot of capacity expansion models, I believe. It uses MERA2 grid cells to cover the whole country, which I believe are 0.5 degrees latitude and 0.25 degrees longitude or something. There's about 3,000 potential grid cells that copper is able to build wind or solar plants in. All of those have specifically generated capacity curves. They're taken from a 2021 weather year. So right now, these are not clustered. These are all these are all disparate points. There are plans in the future towards looking at clustering these to improve model runtime, but we also do think this is a pretty interesting aspect of the copper model that kind of makes it stand out in terms of being able to look at specific locations where these are built. Those are then passed on to the silver model. So there are specific, capacity factor curves that are resolute to the hourly level. Yes. I mean, it's not quite VRE. We also do have specific hydro projects that can be built. We have kind of a list of specific hydro renewals and new hydro projects, which makes copper kind of mixed integer. So it either has to build these projects or not. So we do feel like we're pretty thorough with our renewable resource capacity expansion.
Great, thank you. And maybe a quick add to that, we've also been doing a lot of work on kind of validating the VRE data those 3,000 different grid cells. And so we're in the process of updating some of that data to kind of be even from what we see as an even more kind of credible source. But so that'll be forthcoming in another copper release in a month or two. Yeah, just to add on to that, that's definitely something we've been focusing quite a bit on. So to move to the next question, what was the industrial sector source of the data on slide 12? I think that's probably for Aaron.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you mean the data around load shapes. And assuming that's the case, most of them come from the Electric Power Research Institute. There's a tool called the Load Curve Library. I'm using data from 8.0 version of that. Mostly that's machine drive, process heat, and HVAC for industrial end uses. And then for other end uses, right now, we're assuming kind of the bulk load curve. That said, we kind of think about these load curve inputs as like a scenario. So in the version online, you can go in and change that however you think. So if you think there are like more peaky load shapes for specific end uses, that's something that is open to play around with. And then just to add, if your question is around like other data to parameterize CIMS industrial sectors, I think most of the data, and Brad will correct me if I'm wrong, is from the Canadian Energy and Emissions Data Center. And so that's, Brad directs that information, and that's out of SFU. Hopefully that answers your question. Thanks.
Brad, anything to add there?
No, that's right. So energy and emissions data comes from the data center. Technology data, it tends to be a real hodgepodge for industry. We get it wherever we can. So, cost data might be coming from industry reports, technology details, the same thing, or maybe from government reports. It's a real mix.
Great. Thanks, Brad. And thanks for, of course, thanks to both question or askers of questions so far. And thanks to everybody who's dropped questions in. To the next one, is the CIMS model providing sectoral demand profiles? That might be, I guess, what your answer.
Yeah, I can start, and then Brad, if you have thoughts there, that'd be great as well. The way I'm interpreting this question, the sectoral demand profiles would be more of an output of this linking tool. So kind of like the link that we've built between CIMS and Copper, we can provide sectoral demand profiles. On the version that we've made public, I don't think we actually do that yet by sector. That's certainly functionality we could add if there's interest around that. That's not necessarily like something that CIMS is built to answer, but it could be something that comes out of the linking tool.
Anything to add, Brad? Or it sounds like, or
No, CIMS stops at the annual energy use, but annual energy by end use. So we don't do anything with a daily or an hourly profile.
And then am I right in thinking that from the linking tool, it's like, yeah, we have that, at least where we can, the granularity of technology specific demand profiles. And it's just that for like, at least to the extent that that's already represented across the sector somebody's interested in, they just have to aggregate that to whatever, wherever they want to place that sectorally.
Yeah, so the way we built it now, we aggregate up by province to the very top because that's what that's the information we're passing into Copper, but there's no reason that we couldn't disaggregate, re-aggregate and disaggregate however people want.
Right, yeah. Cool, makes sense. On to the next question. What is the convergence criteria metrics you look at to decide if another iteration of the Copper CIMS loop is needed? Maddie, it's probably for you.
Yes. So there are a few different convergence criteria that we can use. We can look at essentially basically like at the lowest level, what we're doing is we're comparing the previous run's CIMS inputs of electricity price to the new Copper outputs of electricity prices. And we can compare them down to sector, province, and year level, which is what we've used for these runs. So basically, in this case, the settings that we had, it needed to be within 5% of the previous value, above and below, for each year, for each sector, for each province. So there were quite a few places that it had to be kind of basically dead on You can laxen those constraints and make it just by total like average provincial rate, or you can even go higher and say just average kind of national rate needs to be in line. But we've done it with the strictest criteria for this one, and that is all customizable from the linkage configuration file. You can choose which metric you want to set as your convergence criteria, and then the kind of tightness of that convergence.
Great. Thanks, Maddie. And then I think we have three more questions, though we might have time for one or two more, so feel free to drop in another if there's one that's percolating or brewing. So this next question, directed at Maddie, for the movement from copper to silver, how are you implementing the generation asset disaggregation? Do you have specific siting requirements or an established framework you're using? Related question on load, are you disaggregating loads to more local nodes/zones?
Yeah, so this is very topical, and we're always looking to improve this. Right now, we don't actually cite new builds. Copper just built like it, other than VRE. So VRE is cited within copper. It's building on a specific grid cell, which we can tie to, roughly 50 kilometer by 70 kilometer area. For thermal generators, they're not actually cited because copper just builds them on a kind of generic provincial node. So we are kind of placing them on a bit of an abstract node within silver. For existing generation, we're using existing assets and their location and the existing infrastructure, including transmission lines. But for new builds, they are kind of just being assigned to normally the largest node or the most well-connected node of the system. The question on loads is also something we are currently working on right now. Right now, we do have a way of distributing provincial loads because that's all the kind of publicly available data that we're using on the regular to build up these scenarios, because it's very hard to get more disaggregated load data. But we are making approximation of load distribution based on, so this might be getting too technical. In coders, each node location is assigned a kind of bulk purpose. So whether it's a generation node, a distribution node, a industrial node, I think are the main three, switching station. And so we are looking at the distribution nodes and the industrial nodes and looking at the total transmission capacity going into those nodes, and then kind of distributing the load based on the ratio of how that transmission capacity is distributed across the province. Much to be improved on in this regard, but it's kind of what we have with the data that we have publicly available and is kind of our best bet. But if anyone has more data they are willing to share and make publicly available, we're always open to looking into that and hosting that.
Great, thank you. And there have been a few more questions added in, so we'll endeavor to get through all of them because 4 probably is the max amount we can. Next question is, among the technologies, can biomass also be paired with CCS, i.e. is BECCS included in the models? And like somebody added on top of that, can we adjust the amount of public money in CCS? The answers, I guess, might differ for copper and CIMS, particularly for the second question. I'm not sure, but perhaps, yeah, Brad or Maddie, do you want to take this one first?
Sure, I'll start on our side. So yes, so we have BECCS. BECCS is only in the power sector for CIMS, but it's something we can easily add to other industrial sectors if we have some way to characterize that. As for the amount of public money, so in CIMS, because we don't do the macro side of things, public money kind of comes out of nowhere. But you can adjust the amount of, say, a subsidy or an ITC that's going to the purchase of CCS. So we can play around with that kind of number.
Yeah, similarly in copper, it kind of runs from a kind of this abstract national system operator perspective. So like we did here by kind of essentially doubling the ITCs that was kind of pulled out of thin air, but again, can be investigated more with a macro linkage. BECS currently is not in copper, but you can adjust which technologies are considered under ITCs, at least within copper.
Great, thanks both. And maybe just to clarify, or it's kind of implied in Brad's answer, but just to clarify in case anybody was wondering, for the linkage that we presented here, because we've kind of, in this case, focused on the copper's representation of the power sector, in the results here, the power sector in CIMS is kind of like turned off. But yeah, as Brad was saying, sorry to just call you by the model, Brad, that you spend a lot of time with. As Brad was saying, in CIMS, it still has a power sector, and then if you're just running on its own, then yeah, I guess BECS would be included. And thanks again for the question. Next one, have studies been done to find the minimum frequency of a sample for the copper model for the multimodal analysis of inputs, such as finding something like a Nyquist frequency, or maybe using something like a copula to create multi-distribution to look at cross correlations and or serial correlations? I didn't understand a lot of the question, but I think that's heavily related to the work on one of the grad students on our team. We're looking at Aaron and Maddie, related to, we have somebody on our team kind of exploring, and particularly she's been exploring within copper, uncertainty and sensitivity analysis, and using fancy methodologies to assess the relationship between inputs and outputs and everything. And yeah, I feel like I've heard those words before.
We may have to get back to you on that one, Brian. I don't think the uncertainty analysis we're doing is along those lines. So we can reach out, we can get back in touch with you and discuss further.
Yeah, but definitely interested if that does relate to some kind of uncertainty analysis stuff. We're definitely interested in part of people on our team working on that. And so right, yeah. And we have talked about it, doing that kind of analysis as well. Although I haven't really focused on it yet. So perhaps, yeah, we'll follow up. Either if you can follow up with us, or we'll try and track down your email through the invite list. It would be great to chat more after this. Cool. So thanks. Yeah, thanks again for that. And then last two questions. Michelle, I didn't see it in the slides. Are copper and silver? Oh, okay. Thanks, Evan. I already answered that. Whoops. Then last question that we have here, did you try to apply the model to historic data to compare model outputs to actual situation and see how the actual system could have been better, or see what are the weaknesses of the model? I think the answer is different for CIMS and copper again, so maybe I'll let Brad, if you want to speak to CIMS first, and then we can speak to copper.
Yes. Excuse me. So CIMS starts, we start modeling in the year 2000. And then basically up until 2020, we're using that as a counterfactual for calibrating our model. We're not trying to recreate the past, because there's a bunch of stuff that happened in the real world that our model doesn't capture. But we are trying to capture the long-term trends of the energy system. So, was there a move to this technology or that, or what were prices doing? So we're trying to represent that with some fidelity in the model, but we're not trying to replicate the past.
Great, thanks, Ben. And Maddie?
Yeah, same with copper, but I think maybe even to a further degree, because there's very little behavioral, I mean, unless we're counting money behavioral, but debatable. It's pure, like copper is purely a cost optimization model. So we know that there are a lot more factors that go on in real life rather than purely just minimizing costs. What we found more valuable for copper is, and I know some people in the webinar here today is multimodal comparisons. So comparing other capacity expansion models to each other, because it's less about replicating historical and more about where we're going from here. So very hard to kind of use historical to validate capacity expansion models, but it's very interesting to compare different capacity expansion model outputs to each other. And we presented on that last year at the EMH forum, and I believe we are looking to do that again this year. So hopefully some more insight can be derived from that.
Great. And then one thing I'll just add to that is on the power system side, where copper sits in this linkage. We, in the Open Insights project, one of the other models we're currently working on, and a few months away from doing any like a webinar like this and release on it, but in a few months we'll be releasing what we're for now is calling an electricity agent-based model, yet to be kind of fully named. But the intention of that is very much more to capture kind of the relevant behaviors that influence or I guess are at play in real decision making in the power sector. And absolutely what we've already been working on with that model is a kind of extensive validation over historical time periods. So the intention or the goal or objective of that model being part of the suite is really to have then a model that, whereas Copper is trying to do this assessment of what the optimal power system is, that model will be a lot more focused on like what are the real world constraints and are we capturing those if under certain policies, or how does that influence people's reaction to certain policies or agents' reaction to certain policies. So if that's of interest, happy to share more about that offline.
Amazing. I think we're out of time already. So I want to thank Devin, Maddie, Aaron, and Brad for presenting this, and the EMH team for contributing to this discussion and bringing this slides together. So before we let you go to your day, of course, if you want to still be involved with the EMH, please reach out to us. There's many opportunities, either to test the models, provide feedbacks, compare your models with others through the multimodal comparison forum. We'll be issuing more information on this in the next few weeks. We are always looking also to engage with you guys on different workshop or webinars to create more awareness around those tools. You can find most of the information. We try to keep our website updated. You can either go on the EMH website or on the M3 platform website. You have the address there. You can also browse the data sets and assumptions database on coders. We've reprinted here the repos to the CIMS tools, and as well as the linkage tool that was presented by Devin. I think we're missing the redirect link here, but we'll add it in the follow-up email. So thanks again for joining us today. Stay tuned. There'll be other webinar this fall, starting in September, October, and November, to talk about other tools from the Open Insight suites. So we hope to see you there, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for attending today. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.